Look at the rooftops, not the modern ones, the old ones, the ones that survived whatever happened in the mid-1800s when entire city centres across Europe, Russia and North America were either destroyed, buried or quietly handed over to a new class of rulers who told everyone the buildings had always been theirs. Look at the rooftops of the old cathedrals, the old administrative buildings, the old exchange halls and civic structures that show up in daguerreotypes from the 1840s and 1850s, already ancient looking, already covered in grime, already missing entire wings that nobody ever explained. Flat, reinforced, edged with heavy balustrades, dotted with anchor points and iron rings that historians have spent 150 years calling decorative. Decorative. Iron rings bolted into stone rooftops 6 stories up in repeating patterns, spaced at intervals that match no known architectural style, serving no structural purpose that any conventional engineer has ever satisfactorily explained. Just decorative. Just there for the look of the thing. That explanation works fine if you never ask the next question. But once you ask it, you cannot stop. What were they anchoring? The Tartaria hypothesis for anyone coming to this fresh is the idea that the civilization we call medieval Europe, and the broader empire sometimes called the mudflood civilization, was not a primitive precursor to our modern world. It was a more advanced one, a civilization with technology we do not fully understand, erased in a coordinated reset somewhere between the 1700s and 1850s, its infrastructure repurposed, its records destroyed or rewritten, and its population replaced or re-educated into believing they were the inheritors of a long climb upward from barbarism rather than the survivors of a deliberate demolition. And one of the most persistent threads inside that hypothesis is this: they flew. Not in the way we fly, with combustion engines and jet fuel and aluminum tubes. Something different, something that used the energy of the atmosphere itself, or the electromagnetic field of the Earth, or principles of resonance and frequency that our current physics textbooks have spent a century quietly walking away from ever since Nikola Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room and the government showed up the next morning to take everything in his safe. The buildings are the evidence. Start with the most obvious thing, the thing that is sitting right in front of every person who has ever looked at a photograph of old Tartarian architecture and felt something they could not name. These buildings are overbuilt for their stated purpose by any rational engineering standard. The wall thickness, the foundation depth, the quality of the stone, the precision of the joinery, the load-bearing capacity of rooftops that, by the official historical record, were never meant to carry anything heavier than a few feet of snow. You do not build a roof to those tolerances unless something is landing on it. You do not reinforce a flat surface at that structural level unless you expect vertical force loads from above, repeated, regular and significant. Structural engineers who have analysed the original load calculations embedded in Tartarian-era buildings have noted repeatedly that the rooftop platforms of these structures were capable of supporting weights far in excess of anything the official historical narrative places there. One analysis of a well-preserved administrative building in Central Europe found that the rooftop surface had been designed with a load tolerance roughly 4 times what would be required for maintenance access and weather exposure. 4 times. That is not architectural excess. That is a landing pad. Now look at the geometry. Across dozens of old world cities, the flat-roofed sections of major civic buildings are arranged at consistent orientations relative to each other, not identical, but consistent. The flat platforms face specific compass bearings with a regularity that is difficult to explain through coincidence. In several Russian cities photographed in the 1860s and 1870s, before the renovation wave that converted or demolished most of the original structures, the rooftop platforms of buildings in the civic centre aligned along a northwest to southeast axis with a precision that would require surveying equipment to achieve deliberately. Nobody has explained why. In the old engravings and early photographs you can also see the infrastructure. The anchor rings are the most obvious, but they are not the only ones. There are recessed channels cut into rooftop stone at regular intervals that match no drainage pattern. Water drains downward by gravity. It does not require precision-cut channels in the horizontal surface of a roof, channels that run parallel to each other at equal spacing, channels whose depth and width are consistent to tolerances that require machine cutting rather than hand tools. Those channels are not for water. They are guides, alignment tracks, the kind of surface feature you put on a landing platform to ensure that whatever is coming down lands in the right position and stays there. There are also the towers. The Tartarian cityscape, when you look at the original pre-reset photography and the surviving engravings, was dominated by towers. Not bell towers in the conventional sense, though many were later retrofitted with bells to explain their presence. Towers that rise from rooftop platforms with no windows at the upper levels, with metallic or ceramic caps that have been described in restoration records as electrical insulators, with internal shafts that go nowhere by any conventional architectural logic. The official explanation is aesthetic. Towers for visual effect, spires for God and beauty and civic pride. But look at the placement. These towers are not random. They cluster around the flat rooftop sections. They ring the landing platforms at consistent distances. In several surviving complexes, you can trace a clear geometric relationship between the tower positions and the center of the rooftop platform. A relationship that looks, to anyone with experience reading engineering diagrams, like a docking system, a guidance array, something that would allow an aerial craft to identify the platform from altitude and align its approach. Tesla called them energy transmission towers. He spent the last decades of his life trying to rebuild from first principles a system he seemed to believe had once existed globally. His Wardenclyffe Tower was not an invention. By his own fragmentary notes, it was a reconstruction. He knew what it was supposed to do because he had seen evidence of what the original network had done. Free energy, broadcast through the atmosphere, receivable by any properly tuned device within range of a tower node. A flying machine that ran on broadcast atmospheric energy would not need fuel. It would not need runways. It would need proximity to the tower network and a flat, reinforced surface to set down on. Every major Tartarian city had both. The photographic evidence from the period immediately after the reset is some of the most revealing. In the American case specifically, the cities that appear in daguerreotypes and early photographs from the 1840s through 1860s show a consistent pattern. Massive ornate civic buildings already present before the populations that supposedly built them had arrived. Census records showing tiny frontier towns of a few hundred people occupying structures that would have required thousands of skilled craftsmen and decades of construction to complete. Historians handle this contradiction by simply not addressing it. The buildings are there. The population to build them is not in the records. Moving on. But in those same photographs, look at what is missing. The scaffolding, the construction equipment, the raw material stockpiles, the workshops. When a civilization builds, it leaves traces of the building process. Lumber yards, brick kilns, quarry roads. None of it appears in the early American photographic record around the grand civic structures. The buildings simply exist, fully formed, as if they had always been there because in any functional sense they had. They were inherited, not built. They were the infrastructure of the previous civilization, repurposed by the new management. And on the rooftops of those buildings, the anchor rings, the channels, the towers with their ceramic caps and their empty internal shafts pointing toward a sky that the new civilization no longer knew how to use. There is also the question of the craft themselves. The historical record, when you look at it without the filter of official interpretation, is full of flying objects that nobody is supposed to notice. Medieval illuminated manuscripts contain images of disc-shaped objects in the sky over cities and battlefields that art historians describe as symbolic representations of divine presence. Except they are not in the places where symbolic divine presence typically appears in medieval iconography. They are in the background, incidental, ordinary seeming. The kind of detail an illustrator includes because it was part of the visual landscape of the period, not because it carried theological weight. The airship wave of the 1890s is another thread. Hundreds of credible witnesses across the United States and Europe reported structured aerial craft in the years between 1896 and 1910. Not glowing lights, not vague shapes, structured craft with gondolas, with lights, with mechanical sounds, moving against the wind at controlled speeds and altitudes. The official historical position is that these were misidentifications of early experimental balloons and prototype aircraft, despite the fact that no experimental program of the period produced anything capable of the flight characteristics described, and despite the fact that many of the craft were reported landing briefly in remote areas before departing. Landing in remote areas, where the old tower network was thinner, where the energy broadcast was weaker, where a craft running low on whatever it used for power might need to set down. The timing is important. The 1890s airship wave comes roughly 40 to 50 years after the reset. 40 to 50 years is about 2 generations, long enough for the population that remembered the old world to have died off, long enough for the institutional knowledge of how the system worked to have been fully suppressed, but not quite long enough for every craft to have run out of whatever stored energy or autonomous operating capacity they had been built with. They were still flying, on fumes, essentially. The last operational remnants of a global aerial civilization moving through the skies of a world that had been deliberately taught to find their presence inexplicable. The flat rooftops were waiting for them, still structurally sound, still oriented correctly, the anchor rings still in the stone, the alignment channels still cut into the platforms, but the towers were silent, the network was down, and without the energy broadcast, whatever came down could not go back up. The great civic buildings of the old world were not just government halls and cathedrals and exchange buildings, they were nodes in a civilization-wide infrastructure system. The ornate facades were not vanity, the massive construction was not excess, the flat reinforced rooftops were not aesthetic choices. They were the ground-level interface of a global aerial transportation network, built by a civilization that understood energy and resonance and atmospheric electromagnetism in ways that our current science is only beginning to approach from the other direction. We walk past their buildings every day. We look up at their rooftops from the street below. We run our hands along the iron anchor rings and read the placard that says decorative ironwork, 19th century, and we move on. But the rings are still there. The channels are still cut into the stone. The towers still point at the sky. And somewhere in the restricted archive of every major national museum in the world, there are documents that explain exactly what they were for. Documents that have not been declassified, documents that may never be, because the people who control the narrative of human history understand something that the rest of us are only starting to figure out. The old world was not less than us, it was more, and the rooftops prove it.